Hey guys, welcome back. We are back in the shop at Rudy's. Well, just like every day, but we are going to tear down a F4 Magneto, which would be for a Farmall F12, F14, F20, F30, some of the McCormick Deerings, W30, stuff like that. But we'll go down, tear down, sandblast, inspection, rebuild, the whole works. So let's get into it. Alright, jumping into the F4 Magneto. First things first, we're going to pull the magnet bracket off so that we can lift the magnet off. Now, when we take these apart, we're going to be looking for a lot of different things. Pulling that cap off, we look at the carbons, and that'll tell us what kind of wear we might expect on the rotor. Moving forward from there, you can start pulling the coil cover off. It's 4 screws, 2 on top, 2 on bottom. Pretty simple. These magnetos are in some ways simpler than a H4, but in other ways they are more difficult. These, for instance, the inductor rotor is not magnetized because the magnet is on the outside, obviously. Here we're removing the seal from the points cover. Excuse me. This isn't absolutely necessary, but I like to do it for blasting purposes so that I don't ruin the seal. Remove the cover, remove the gasket, and from there we can start removing the front cover that covers the impulse assembly. It's held on by 4 screws, and this one has a manual lockout for the impulse for when you adjust the timing on the coupling of the tractor. Like I said, there's 4 screws all the way around. They, the front cover on this one, I notice as we're taking it apart, is broken. So we do end up replacing it with another one. And you can replace these front covers with the manual lockout for the impulse assembly with a standard one. Just kind of removing some of the dirt out of the slot on the screw. But the front covers are interchangeable. Quite a bit of stubborn dirt and grease in this one. There we go. So as we continue to remove the cover, keep looking things over. I enjoy doing these magnetos because they're a little more primitive in how they're constructed, but each magneto in itself is kind of unique. So there's some similarities between most magnetos, but there are also a lot of large differences, which seems like it doesn't make sense, but once you start tearing into different manufacturers of them, you'll start to understand. But there's that broken ear that's on the front cover. There's also a chip out of the front or leading edge. So from there we can remove the 2 latches for the impulse. Remove the nut that holds the front plate on the impulse. There's a nut, a lock washer, and a flat washer with a notch and tab in it. Pull the front plate off. It is under spring tension. And we can use the special puller and pull the actual impulse off with the spring. From there we can remove the spring and be careful because like that one, they can go flying. Remove the key from the shaft. Set that aside because it'll be reused. And we can go about removing the points cover clip. Remove the other two screws that hold the rear section and bearing carrier on. This also holds the points, the advance mechanism, and there's an internal cup inside that carrier that is actually what holds the points, and it turns inside that carrier to advance and retard the spark. And there's a small tab inside there that actually will ground the mag and kill the spark, which will then shut off the tractor. So right now I'm removing the lead out tower. This one was chipped on the bottom side, so we will replace it. If they're in good condition, we will reuse them. There's no sense in replacing something that's perfectly good. But this one was chipped, so we had to replace it. I have seen them where they looked good and had no chips in them, but the body itself was actually cracked and allowing the spark to escape. So occasionally you'll even run into something that appears good and is in fact not. From there we can remove the condenser nut, remove the wires from the condenser, and ultimately remove the condenser. Pretty simple process to disassemble these. You don't need much for special tools except for the puller for the front impulse, and that's actually the incorrect condenser for that Magneto. And right now we are removing the tower that holds the rotor and the lead out. It's just two screws. Now underneath this tower there are shims that the purpose is to develop the right kind of backlash between the rotor and the pinion drive gear. I was just pointing out the timing mark on that gear. There's the shims that were underneath the tower itself. And then from there we can remove the coil. Just two screws, one front and one rear. This coil looks to be most likely the original. It's the old dipped in tar style coil. And these little paper, I'm not sure the technical name for them, but I'll call them paper washers. We discard those. We don't typically reuse them. And from there we can remove the inductor rotor, the rear carrier. You do have to be careful with that wire because if they are good, the original cloth woven wires, we'll reuse them. We'll clean up the contacts, but if the wires are good, we'll reuse them because the small brass contact that goes into the back of that cup that holds the points, they are not available new anymore. So if we find one with a bad wire, we'll remove the solder, remove the brass end, and then solder on a new wire and new ring terminal. But again, if it's a perfectly good part, especially an original wire like that, we'll use it. So now we can be very careful using a screwdriver to push this out. And right now I'm working my way side to side to push evenly on that internal cup so that we can remove it from the bearing carrier. Seems to be some dirt dauber crud in there. We also like to inspect the oiling cups. If there are any cracks on any of the oiling cups, we can replace them. Inspect the bearing races, make sure they're not pitted or significantly scored or worn. This is that wire I was talking about earlier. This one has a bunch of electrical tape on it, so we will replace the wire itself, but reuse the original end. Remove the inductor rotor and remove the bearings from the inductor rotor. Now this one was in okay shape. All we had to do was clean it up. And later on I'm going to show you an example of a bad inductor rotor. I'm just pointing out the two beveled teeth that coincide with the timing mark on the rotor gear itself. But this inductor rotor looks pretty good. Now we'll press the coil bar out of the coil, because we will reuse that. It'll get polished before it gets installed into the new coil. Just needed to get a little bit longer bolt for pressing it out. The last one wasn't quite long enough. Now we can remove the rotor gear from the tower, and there's a small circlip that keeps the rotor gear and shaft in that tower. So I just use an X-Acto knife to remove that clip. Then we can just pull that tower off. Now I like to remove, there's a little washer there with a tab on it to centralize the clip. I like to remove the small cork. Then there's a long felt inside this tower that holds oil for the bushing for that rotor shaft. And then I use a little bit of compressed air because there's another felt that has a spring attached to it inside the journal itself that distributes the oil to the shaft. So there's the small washer with the tab and the circlip. Set those aside, they will be reused. We'll clean this up in the blasting cabinet. So here's the housing all cleaned up, the inductor rotor and bearings ready to go, polished. This is an example of a bad inductor rotor. You can see the heavy scoring on the large round portions. Here's the example of a good one that's been polished and ready to assemble. So we'll slide that in. Notice that we have a slightly greased bearing race on the inside. Rotate it around to distribute the grease. We can install the coil bar into the coil. Should just press in pretty easily. Some of them can be more stubborn than others if there's some excess plastic inside that hole where the coil bar goes into. Insert the screws. In the front, we have to make sure that we get that ground strap bent down appropriately. Make sure that the contact on the top of the coil is facing straight up. You don't want to have any left or right lean to it, otherwise it won't line up with the contact on the lead out tower. So ensure that that contact on the coil is facing straight up and vertical. Alright, at this point we can quickly install the shims for the tower. And we will install the rotor. And right now I'm just pushing that spring-loaded felt down back into place. I've already put the felts back in the tower itself. Install the washer with tab, and then the circlip. And these can be kind of tricky to get on with your fingers. Sometimes you have to use a screwdriver to push it down into the groove, or a pick. And that bushing does get a light coating of oil before we put that rotor back into the tower. So here we're just aligning the timing marks on the rotor gear and the pinion gear. Installing the 2 screws that hold the tower to the magneto body. We also, before we reinstall that rotor gear, we resurfaced it because the carbons on the cap can wear a very deep groove into those rotor gears. Sometimes they are worn beyond resurfacing and you have to replace them. Just installing the key on the front so that we can install the impulse assembly. Install the small latch assemblies for the impulse. Now there's a small spring that hooks onto this small latch that I'm installing now. So you have to make sure you install that and get that put together appropriately. Just putting a little bit of oil on the small shafts that these latches ride on. And you don't want to put anything together dry because these are all moving parts and a little bit of oil can go a long way. Okay, putting the impulse together. I put a light coat of grease inside that cup, and then we can wind the spring down into it. Remember, this is a clockwise rotating mag, so the spring will wind clockwise. Just tap it down into place to make sure that it's all seated. A little bit of grease on the spring itself. Just to kind of help things along as it rotates and compresses and relaxes the spring. That grease will help lubricate everything. And then we can put the drive plate itself in. And this is what, there's a slot in that drive plate that aligns with the tab on the spring. And then we'll need to rotate that around to preload the spring, just like you would a recoil on a small engine. You can install the impulse on the front of the shaft with the nut, lock washer, and flat washer with the tab that aligns with the small notch in the impulse. So you want to make sure that you get that tab aligned with that notch. Otherwise that washer will not sit like it's supposed to. It's probably easier to do with the Magneto standing up on end, but while sitting on its base, it's manageable. You can get it done. So from there we can lock the manual latch into the impulse so that we can tighten the nut and the impulse and inductor rotor won't turn on us. Just testing everything, making sure we got a good snap in the impulse. We can install the front cover, but I noticed that this one actually has the pin that small latch rides on still in the cover, because this is a replacement cover. So sometimes those pins will stick into the cover and sometimes they'll remain in the body, but it's real simple. You just take a pliers, remove that pin, and then slide the front cover on. This can be tricky though, because you're trying to align two different pins, and then there's also a shoulder that goes around the body, the lower portion of the body that centers the cover itself. So you're kind of aligning three different things at once. And what I'm doing now is installing that manual lockout for the impulse latch. So you just kind of wiggle things into place. This is the points advancing and retarding cup. Install the new wire with the brass end. Install the screw, and I do this just so the end doesn't fall out of the block while you're assembling everything. I put a very, very light coat of grease on the inside of the carrier, just enough to lubricate it. You don't need an excess amount. Feed the wire through the bottom hole, and there's a small stud that you have to align with a notch in that cup in order for it to slide in, and that stud is actually what grounds out the magneto. When you rotate that cup, there's a small tab that grounds out on that stud inside that cup. So I'm just checking the rotation and make sure it's not binding, and this one feels a little bit loose, so we're actually gonna remove it, and there's two tabs that we can bend to give it a little bit more contact on the inside of that carrier. And the reason you want that is because if you don't have good contact, it won't ground out. So here, I'll bend out, there's a tab on one side, and it just takes a little bit, tab on the other, and we'll find that as we reassemble this, I actually bent them out a little bit too much, so we'll have to take them apart again and adjust those tabs because it becomes too difficult to turn. You don't want to make it too difficult to turn because you're just operating it with a small lever from the operator's platform on the tractor. And there's actually a blooper at the end of the video if you want to watch. I recommend it's not for the queasy, so stay tuned for that. So now we got everything working properly. A little bit of grease on the inner race of that carrier. Kind of work the wire into place, and then there's this small shield that goes in place to prevent the wire from getting up into the gear of the pinion gear on the inductor rotor. And this can be kind of tricky to get it all worked out because you cannot install that shield all the way. You have to only install it partially while you work that bearing carrier into place. And they slowly kind of have to be pushed in together. And then you have to ensure that the wire isn't getting pinched as well. So just aligning everything, installing the new condenser in both wires from the contacts and from the coil. Install the lock washer and nut. Tighten everything down. Ensure that the clamp for the condenser is tight. You can give the nut for the condenser one last turn. Now for this you have to ensure that the wires are tucked away because you don't want them to interfere with the coil cover and gasket coming down over the top. At this point we can install the lead out tower. The contact has been polished up. We also make sure that the carbon is in place and in good condition. Now I've seen these with carbons in them, a spring-loaded carbon, and then I've also seen them where people have just used a spring to make contact with the contact inside the distributor cap. Either way is fine. They both function the same, whether it's a carbon or a spring. Now you don't want to over tighten these things because keep in mind they are just holding a plastic tower to an aluminum, or a plastic piece to an aluminum tower, so we don't need to really reef on them. Here I'm just adjusting the safety gap, which is a small lead that goes to ground. Should something happen where the wires become disconnected or you lose the carbons inside the distributor cap, which does happen quite frequently, that's what causes a lot of problems with the inductor rotor getting scored up. Those springs can end up down inside the rotating assembly, and then it can really mess things up inside there because there's such tight tolerances between the magneto body and the inductor rotor itself. So here we're just installing the points, and they will get set to 0.013 or 13 thousandths. So I think my dog is getting ready to eat her dinner and drink her water, so I apologize if she gets a little bit noisy in the background, but just finishing up the points here. And when you adjust them, make sure that you're on that the movable contact is on the high point of the lobe on that cam in the rear section of the inductor rotor there. So again, we'll set them to 13 thousandths. and give it a final tighten. Yeah, she's gonna eat her food here. Always while I'm doing the recording, right? So the points are set. We can cover them up with the points cover. That gasket has a gap in the bottom. Remember, that gap has to go towards the bottom. Then we can swing the spring clip down into place to secure the points cover. Make sure that everything rotates appropriately. Now we've got our test magnet on it, and we're just going to rotate it over a few times, check that the spark jumps that safety gap. You can see it if you look closely. So we've got good spark. We can put the coil cover on with the gasket. And this gasket can be kind of tricky because there's a pin that it has to align on in the rear section, and then there's a brass oiling tube that comes down in the middle of the front section of that cap or cover. So once we get that work down into place, we can install our 4 screws. Remember, it's 2 in the front and 2 in the rear. And the front ones are kind of difficult to get aligned because there's no tube that guides them down to the bottom holes. So you kind of have to feel around and find the front 2 holes in the magneto body. And it can be kind of a challenge. But these ones lined right up without issues. So don't tighten them all the way before you get the rear ones installed, because it can, you know, sometimes those coil covers need to be moved around a bit to get all 4 screws aligned. You have to allow room for the gasket to be moved around too. So we've got the coil cover on. We can slide the magnet into place with the distributor cap clips. They have to be installed prior to putting the magnet all the way into place. We can put the magnet bracket in place. Just 2 screws hold that magnet bracket down, or hold down strap. Tighten those down. Once we get those tight, the last thing we have to do is install the distributor cap. Now, we do have new distributor caps. They come with new carbons, new springs. And from there we can, I'm just testing the movement of all the carbons. From there we can get the magneto on the test bench and see what we've got. So let's head over to the bench. I like to rotate over by hand just to check that the impulse is working properly, that we have spark at a slow speed with the impulse working. Make sure there's no binding anywhere. And we can go ahead and fire it up at high speed, and as you can see, we've got great spark. So that's going to do it for this video. Stay tuned for the blooper. As I said, if you're queasy, don't watch it. And thanks for watching.